One of the things you've been an advocate for is regulation of big tech. You've actually testified in front of Congress about it. It also seems like you're part of a movement to really address that from within the industry. Do you feel that regulation's needed, or do you think that market forces will rectify this over the long term?
My answer to this was different a year ago, in that I think my answer to this a year ago was that we absolutely had to create regulation, that we should potentially repeal or heavily amend Section 230. Section 230 is the Communications Decency Act, which was established in 1996 under the Clinton administration. It really is the reason that things like Facebook and YouTube and others have been able to flourish, because it is allowed for internet platforms to get established and scale without any of the content liability traditional media company has. YouTube, for instance, does not have liability for the harms that are caused by the content on its platform. Whereas if I'm a newspaper and I write a slanderous article, I have liability. And the whole point of that act was to allow these platforms to prosper, and it did a pretty good job. Now there's sort of this concern that, well, none of these platforms have any accountability or liability for all the content that propagates, so we should in fact make them liable. If they're liable, if they're prompted to pay for the harms that they perpetuate, well, then maybe they'll get their act together. And my argument at the time, by the way, was, if you look at the history of Facebook and the chatter 10 years ago and the criticism around Facebook 10 years ago, it was largely around privacy. There was a huge issue around data leakage and people's privacy being, exploited. And the interesting thing is that once the FTC finally stepped in and said, they threatened Facebook for a long time around all these privacy missteps. They finally said, this is ridiculous. Here's a $5 billion fine. And if you look at the privacy slip-ups that Facebook has had since that fine, you would be hard-pressed to find. So the argument was, look, once the FTC got their stick out and started really penalizing Facebook for being so sloppy on privacy, Facebook suddenly had sort of the resources to take care of these issues. And so could that be the case that if you amended 230 such that Facebook had more liability, would they magically sort out that problem as well? Long-winded point here. I actually think that some of the things that are now emerging over the last 6 to 12 months around this newer area being called Web3, which is this sort of decentralized notion of building out different internet services. I think it's possible that, Dan, to your point, the market will figure it out, and they may figure it out through the guise of this whole new kind of Web3 paradigm. The paradigm being that it's possible through Web3, which is this kind of crypto-enabled ecosystem of software, it's possible that some of these networks could be reconstituted and decentralized such that they could actually disrupt and replace the networks we have today.
I'll tell you, like, one of my big fears about regulation, and you kind of touched on this, is that it almost seems like, and I'll just say the tech industry on the whole, just to draw a big blanket with a specific spotlight on Facebook, but it does seem like Facebook and the tech industry is almost getting to the point where they could be like, the tobacco industry in a way, where they're able to effectively write their own laws, fund their own legislation, because they just have the money. And my fear is that in implementing regulation, we could very well get regulations that favor Facebook, as opposed to ones that allow for upstarts to come and those market forces to start to.
I think it's a great point, and I think it's a huge risk around regulation. And I don't think the point you're making is lost on Facebook. They're advocating for it. They're buying full page ads in the Wall Street Journal saying, please regulate us.
It seems like what you're saying is they should be held accountable for what's on their platform. They've gotten away for so long without that. It's time to hold them accountable. At least that's one course of action that could emerge from this. When they have tried to police content on their platform,
Yeah, it's
we've also
problematic.
seen that sometimes, yeah, they get it wrong. And, most famously in the last 6 or 7 months was not even 6, 7, about a year, this whole theory that maybe the COVID virus escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China. It's still considered a remote possibility, certainly not the leading theory, but also not something that you could just dismiss outright. And even, I think, in the last couple of days, Dr. Fauci is being grilled on whether or not he covered it up to some degree or orchestrated with other doctors
Yeah.
and public health officials to bury this. And so the social platforms all did what we, quote, thought was the right thing, and they shut it down and they banned journalists who talked about it at the time. And now they're like, well, maybe we were a little bit too quick on the trigger there. So are we just begging for censorship in a way? And then when we get it, we're going to be like, oh, crap, maybe this wasn't such a good idea to hold them accountable.
You bring up a great point, and it's one of the, do you want to make Facebook the arbiter of truth? And what are the risks associated with that? And I think they're considerable. And the COVID lab example is one of hundreds of examples that show that when Facebook did step in and tried to be the arbiter of truth, it was problematic. I get into these conversations. I just want to put my head in my hand and just say, well, there's a part of me that's just grateful that I don't have to figure out the answer, that I can kind of pontificate along with you guys, because it is a what a morass and what a disaster and a mess. And the way out is really unclear.